Welcome to Proles at the Round Table.
Hello, and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and talk Marxist history. Check out our website at prolespod.com, where you can find our back catalog, links to all the resources we talk about, and a whole communist ebook library, along with a few recipes. If you want to extra support us, check out our Patreon, where you can give your hard-earned wages to some working-class-ass Marxists in exchange for bonus episodes, clothes, and content. Find out more at patreon.com/prolespod. So we want to thank this episode's primary sponsor, who helps us buy gold thrones and red suits like that one Photoshop picture of Xi Jinping that libs share seriously.
Nice.
Big thanks to our sponsor, the United States Army. Yay. Thank you for your service.
Very cool.
So today we have Jeremy with us. Thanks for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's so first time on the podcast.
Where'd you pick up this guy? Silence.
Long time caller, first time listener.
Yes, exactly.
No, but so it's time for Jeremy to do get back to the old days where he's just gonna go off king on some. No, Jeremy's just gonna tell. What are you gonna tell us about, Jeremy?
So it's complicated.
That's Ethan's line.
Exactly.
So, no, Jeremy's coming on to talk with us about Star Wars.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, finally. We're going to do a whole episode, Marxist analysis on Star Wars.
We like to have fun here on Proles Round Table, but what are we talking about today?
This is basically what I wrote my undergraduate thesis on. And it's I was not joking when I said it was complicated. It's basically about the way history is socially constructed. It's not like we like to imagine history as just sort of a list of facts, things that happened, and that's not necessarily the way it actually is. People who write down history always have an ideological perspective, and whether they're aware of it or not, they are embodying whatever the dominant narratives are within their society. That's why you don't get a whole lot of counter narratives to what we generally understand as U.S. history in a U.S. history classroom. You get, up until very recently, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's only been in the last 20 years that anything other than that has been, brought forward, that he was genocidal, that he was there for money and not exploration. It had nothing to do with grand lofty goals other than let's see what gold or spices or whatever we can bring back to Europe. He was the poster child for imperialism, and that's not the way it's taught. And of course there's a lot more to it, but
so it's sort of like the social reproduction of history.
Yeah, because once you get a narrative going that reinforces the status quo of whatever the system is you're living under, it will begin to self-perpetuate through its history. So you end up with events that happen, right? And other events happen, but we don't talk about those events. Or these events happened, but we don't look at why they happened, and we don't look at the negative impacts of those events. We're going to focus on only the positive side of those things because that's what's best for our country, right? Once that gets going, it gets very difficult to stop because you repeat these stories to your children and they repeat them to their children. They get spread in the news, they're in your history books, and then it just becomes normal and nobody thinks about the fact that there is some other counter narrative, some other story there behind the scenes. And anyway, there's a lot to it, but there's also, there's more than that that's going on here. There's the fact that even when you may think you are giving a counter narrative, even when you may think you are telling a different story, oftentimes you are just telling the same story from a different perspective. But there's a lot. It's complicated.
All right. Well, so before we explore that, let's see who's at the table going to be listening and discussing this.
This is Justin, and tonight I'm drinking Peach Kick. by New Belgium. Worker owned New Belgium.
This is 8 Hop. I'm not drinking anything tonight. I have to leave in a little bit for a union meeting. But
Sad.
yeah,
Sad, very
I mean,
I'm drinking air.
sad. I'm drinking it. Is it drinking or I don't know. This is Alex. I'm drinking bourgeoisie tears.
And I'm drinking Daybreaker,
nice.
which is
It's a good one.
also employee owned, 100% employee owned, New Belgium.
I'm drinking a Dos Equis lager, which is not employee owned, and the can looks like the can looks like a green football.
Football.
It's very
It
strange.
has a lot of
Gross.
X's on it. I
Well,
don't think it's 2.
It's more than Dos Equis.
Cinco Equis.
Cinco.
Cinco X's.
Anyway, cool. So, did you come up with this concept?
Kind of in this particular way. Like I obviously not. No, I mean there are people who came before me who had similar ideas or the same idea, and organized it in their own way. Because this was written as my undergraduate thesis, I kind of had to stick to topics that would be palatable to the liberal academia. And so I wrote it mostly centered around U.S. history and the relationship between the United States as an entity and indigenous people who, they had their land stolen from the United States. Because that's more palatable than, say, going into Soviet history and talking about how Stalin did nothing wrong. Generally not accepted in liberal academia.
I thought
Anti-Stalin paradigm.
Yes.
I thought colleges were a bastion of communism.
Yeah, that's what I heard. And then I got there and it's mostly like libertarians, milquetoast liberals, and like a handful of sock dems and progressives. Yeah,
There was one good
conservatives,
Marxist
too.
professor, but he left. Hide or come back.
Hide or come
Hashtag.
back.
Just for one episode. I don't want you to live here again.
Yeah.
Hide or come back.
So where do you start with this topic? It's sort of like the history of history.
History of history.
Well, with the history of art, we started at before Homo
human-
sapiens
yeah.
was around. But where are you going to start?
So I'd like to kind of give some kind of framework. So like where these ideas come from,
Good stuff.
like foundational, theoretical foundations, because it helps when you get to the like facts later on, to understand like where I was coming from, and like also that these ideas didn't spring forth from my own brain. But there's this quote that has been attributed to a lot of different people. And there's a couple of these that I put in my thesis where like the quotes, nobody's quite sure who said them, which I think is like key to it's whatever. It's a meta response to
Right.
the paper itself. And the phrase is, "We do not see things as they are, we see things as we are," which, as close as I can get, it probably came from Rabbi Shemuel ben Nachmani, but it's
I
been
was going to
attributed
say,
to
I think
a
I
bunch
saw
of different
that. I
people.
saw that in like an inspirational meme on Facebook.
Yeah,
It was like a
Wow.
minion.
yeah. but that is the reality, though, is that like you cannot see things objectively. It is
Right.
literally impossible for anyone to see anything objectively. You always have a perspective that comes from within your own brain, and so yeah, again, you don't see things as they are; you see them as you are.
Well, yeah, that's like similar to what Grover puts in his books. You remember he's like,
Friend of the show,
what
Grover.
things happened, what actually happened, what you think happened, what we say happened, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I had so many conversations in high school when I was a like idiot conservative, where the basis of it was like, these fucking liberals don't even know, won't even agree that there's such a thing as truth. Like, they won't agree that like there are objective facts. Like, am I here? Well, I don't know. Like, I don't know. And like, obviously that's a different thing, but like,
Yeah,
but there is this, I think a lot of people definitely have an understanding that like science is a thing and history is a specific thing that we know exactly what happened.
sure.
And then it's also possible to go onto the other side, like to go too far in the other direction.
Yeah.
Where
There's
there's
no
like,
truth.
Yeah.
Like everything's fine. Like if that's just your beliefs. And
I mean, just because there
Isn't
is
that
no
relativism?
I was going to say, just because there is no such thing as like an objective perspective doesn't mean like we can't behave as though there is some kind of truth, right?
Didn't we
Like,
kind of talk about that on like the end of history episode?
I
Probably.
think so.
That was a long
You
time
touched
ago.
on it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like a
you
year
touched on
ago.
it
And
too
there's
with
going to
the,
be some of that because I was writing my thesis when we
Oh.
recorded that episode. And so there were some things that I pulled out that you're probably going to hear again if you've listened to that episode. But
Yeah, no, but I mean, like, you definitely see a. It's like, well, listen, I may disagree with Richard Spencer, and
Oh, God.
I've seen this. I've seen like
Yeah.
well-meaning, quote unquote, liberals being like, well, listen, I don't agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to
Christ.
say it. Like,
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
The don't touch a Nazi thing, basically.
exactly. That's just they are trying to. Those are their beliefs, and they're just as valid as yours.
except they're not.
Well, that was sarcastic, just for the record. Anyway, yeah. So what's the deal with that?
I began this paper writing about my personal life because it's the story of how I got to the thesis, and I'm not going to go over that because it's a lot.
It's a long story.
It's a long story, but it also there are elements there where I was basically researching my own genealogy, my family history, and there were things that were attractive to me as a person, as in like, that's a thread I want to follow. That's what I don't. And so I like pulled out the fact that our family is descended from the Picts, and like I'd never heard of them before. And I did a ton of research on them, just sort of trying to figure out who were these people and what are they about. And everybody like gave me sort of little pieces of information, different like web forums or books that I read or articles, whatever. They all had different little pieces of information. And part of that journey was not necessarily in getting closer to the truth as much as it was finding out what was not true. Like it wasn't so much as that I got anywhere close to accuracy as I just got further away from inaccuracy, which is like, it's a weird experience because so little is known. It's such like a massive gray area. They existed in prehistory. They didn't have a written language. And so most of what people know about them is conjecture. And so all of these different opinions exist around them, and they all conflict with each other, and everyone is sure that they're the ones who are right. And I think that's interesting because that really, in a lot of ways, is the reality around some aspects of history, but we don't look at it that way because there is one which is dominant. There's one story which is dominant above all others, and everybody else is just sort of like trying to pick away at the margins. But anyway, one of the things that I found in my research, sort of tangentially, is that the Irish are probably not Celtic, and that.
Big if true.
But yeah, I mean, it was wild to me. Like I read this guy, his name's Dr. James Mallory, and he wrote this book called Origins of the Irish. And it's about how there's these sort of successive waves of people who came into Ireland and took over, either killed or interbred with or whatever, the people who were currently living there, going all the way back to the like Mesolithic era. And it was just wave after wave after wave of people, but there is no evidence whatsoever that there was ever a Celtic invasion of Ireland, even though Irish people will desperately cling to this Celtic identity. And part of that is because they were sort of desperately looking for a way to stand up in opposition to the British because of colonialism, right? And so they found this, like they spoke a Celtic language, but all of the evidence points to the fact that that was a matter of like maybe it was a lingua franca, like a trade language. Maybe it was a matter of prestige. The elites, the chieftains started speaking it because that's what the wealthy Celtic traders spoke, and so they picked up on it and started speaking it. But there's no archaeological evidence that Celtic people came in mass to Ireland at any point, and that was a wild thing to learn. But again, these are sorts of those things. Like you have these ideas that just seem like this is the truth, and it's not. You know what I mean? But anyway,
Well, so you probably have an outline for the talk you're going to give here, but like,
no.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess
Bold of you to assume so.
Yeah.
well, just read us the paper.
Yeah, I'll just read it word for word. It's only 60 pages.
Oh, that's fine.
So the question I was going to ask is that like how, so you said you kind of touched on this with getting it was in opposition to British colonialism.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, that's tying into a much larger thing I wanted to get at with like, I guess, how do power relations like that, colonialism, imperialism, which are these economic forces, how do those influence dominant ideology?
Massively. And we're going to get there.
Okay.
But
You do have an outline, goddammit.
I basically am going to follow the line of my paper. So here's another good quote here. It's by this, it gets complicated because the idea of anthropology as an individual field didn't really exist before the like late 19th century. And so people will claim him as like a sociologist or a philosopher or a political economist or whatever.
Which one?
Claude Lévi-Strauss.
Oh. He's an
and he said-
anthropologist. I always heard of
Yeah,
him
he's
as
an
an anthropologist.
But if you're in anthropology, he's an anthropologist. So he said, I therefore claim to show not how men think in myths, but how myths operate in men's minds without their being aware of the fact. So this comes down to that idea of like the myth sits in your head and you have become so accustomed to it that it becomes invisible, right? It doesn't even register that it's there. When you're inundated with a particular narrative over and over and over and over again, it becomes invisible. It becomes nature to you. So one thing that I wanted to make clear is that when we get to the point where we're talking about constructing these narratives, like building them up from the ground up and having these discourses, I'm not really that worried about whether the people who were doing it knew they were lying, because they oftentimes don't. They literally believe the things they're saying. I sincerely doubt that Anne Applebaum doesn't believe the things that she's writing, right? It's in her head that this is the truth. And so she is doing God's work by writing this stuff.
Well, and that gets back at this like liberal agency idea. Like, listen, if your intentions are good, then you can't,
That's what matters.
on some level, you can't be faulted, right? Whereas the opposite is true. It doesn't fucking matter what your intentions are. What matters is the impact
outcome,
that
yeah.
thing. Yeah, exactly. But that's just such a hard thing for some people to grasp.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, again, like I'm sure there are people who obviously there's a whole section here about, the rise of fascism, and how nationalism, necessitates building these myths. And I'm certain that the Nazis and the Italian fascists knew for a fact that they were lying in a lot of cases. But at some point, once that becomes normal, then the people who come up in the second generation of that, they're not lying anymore. These are the things that they believe are true, So anyway, again, not super worried about whether the things are true. It's more a matter of like, what is the impact? So getting back to your question about sort of like power dynamics and imperialism and so I think it does obviously impact people who are on the receiving end of imperialism, but I think it also impacts people who are like imperialists. Like, there is a thing that sort of sinks down inside you that you are justified in your actions, or that these people really are savages or whatever.
And cultures do a lot to reinforce that. Like how there's like the thank you for your service thing with the American military. Yeah. Like, I mean, there's a lot of social rewards for contributing. Exactly. Yeah. But so there's this idea that cannibalism was rife in the Caribbean, right? Like it was reported by Spanish colonists, soldiers, sailors, whatever, who were in the Caribbean, that these tribes are just out here eating people, right? And it's very difficult to pin down whether this was happening or not. I think I remember reading something about this, and they were saying that
the only things that there are evidence for, the only instances of this that there are evidence for were certain like ritual post-death, like people who died of different causes, some, and not like eating the whole thing for food or whatever, but like a sort of
whether
ritual.
It was widespread.
Exactly. And it was not even widespread. Like there were a couple instances of this, and then that gets turned into like, they're just eating people's flesh. They're monsters.
Right. So there's this quote by Michel Rolf Trio, who I called Pierre Trio which is, I'm assuming Pierre Trudeau got in my head. I don't really know where that came from.
Well, that's why no one could find that reference forever.
Like, who was that person? Pierre Trio.
Michel.
Michel Rolf. But anyway, he says, the fantasy has reached such significance for the West that it matters little whether it is based on facts. Does this mean that the line between history and fiction is useless? As long as the conversation involves Europeans talking about dead Indians, the debate is merely academic. Yeah. So it's like that's what it comes down to is although no proof can be found that this was a widespread issue, it doesn't really matter anymore whether it is true or it's not true. It is true in the minds of Europeans, and so the debate is, again, purely academic. The other thing you have to think about too is so there's always, when two cultures come into contact with each other, there's going to be a set of responses based on who has the most power, whether the power is equal. I mean, they may come together, and if their power levels are sort of equal, they may form some kind of a equilibrium, and everybody's
power
fine.
level.
Whoever, what. But if you have one group is significantly more powerful than the other, they get to dictate the rules.
Right.
They get to decide how things happen. And that happens in terms of economics, and it happens in terms of culture, but it also happens with history. If my story is preferable to me than your story, it's not going to get told. So it's very obvious in situations like the U.S. and Venezuela, right? You've got one major power and one minor power, and so it's very easy for the United States to lie about what's going on in Venezuela, and Venezuela not to be able to respond. So Schmidt and Patterson, they wrote this book it's mostly about South America, imperialism, and things of that nature. This sort of interaction.
Well, what about? Hold on, sorry. I'm going to interrupt you anyway.
Yeah.
What about
rude
things like China, right? Who's another major power. So you have two major powers. It's not a minor power and a major power. It's easy for the U.S. to tell one narrative, but China is a very large nation.
Yeah.
And they can tell the other side of the narrative, but nobody
because in China has the most power, but in the U.S., China has almost no power, right?
I see what you mean.
Negative power. But
like in regional power, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the U.S. can spread its stories globally without a problem, and China can do that with its allies.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
But in terms of like Venezuela can't do.
Sure.
Venezuela can't do what China does, right? But also these stories matter more in the countries where they originate, right? Like, again, if the U.S. wants to tell lies about China, there is very little that China can do to counteract that in the United States. But in China, for sure, they can, obviously.
And so I had something related. So I kind of want to break down how this like the steps that are involved in this. Let's give an example of something that people will probably read in the news. Let's talk about the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does this idea start? Okay, so the idea is that China, the People's Republic of China, is imprisoning like millions of Uyghurs, which is a ethnic minority in the People's Republic of China, specifically in the Xinjiang region, is imprisoning millions of them, is trying to stamp out their culture, is putting them in concentration camps, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What are the steps that got that to become an accepted thing where you talk to almost anybody who like pays a little bit of attention to mainstream news, and they'll be like, oh yeah, no, that's a thing that's happening.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this really begins, oh God, I'm going to say 2014. I may be off, but in 2014, there were a series of terrorist attacks in the province, right? Committed by Islamic extremists who happened to be Uyghurs. And so China set about trying to figure out ways of keeping this from happening again, right? Like minimizing the risk of more terrorist attacks. And so they came up with eventually the idea of, we're going to educate them on Chinese culture. We're going to give them vocational training. We're going to teach them, skills that are going to help them to sort of be more productive, I suppose, within society, which will, because often, and this is the thing that capitalist nations tend to forget, is that poverty breeds terrorism. And
well, I think they know. They just
they just don't seem to care enough to try to
Well, it's more important to be capitalist than to not have terrorism.
They're going to, that's going to sow the seeds of its own destruction. But
inshallah,
inshallah. But that's sort of how that process began, right? It was a problem which then needed a solution, and the solution was, let's help these people to not feel like their only recourse is violence, right? Which is it's a great response. It's better than putting them in prison or
and almost every Islamic majority country has said hey, you guys are doing a good job with good things, that. Yeah. That's because we recognize sometimes we have these guys that do these things. This is a great way to deal with that.
It's not a symptom of Islam. It's a symptom of poverty and imperialism and all sorts of things that have led to the United States funding Wahhabism. And there's there's a whole million
you
reasons
do a whole
that this is
episode on terrorism.
Right. But that's the foundation, right? That's the truth. That's the reality behind what's happening. But all it takes is the fact that they are being taken out of their homes and sent to education centers. And they are education centers. That's literally what they are. There are photos of them on the internet. You can go and look at them. People are allowed to leave on the weekends. They're allowed to go home and visit their families. They're allowed to contact their families. They live in dormitories. They're not being kept prisoner. They could technically leave whenever they want, although who knows, they may be prison terms in response to that. I really literally don't know what that policy is, but they are not being kept in camps is what it comes down to.
But the narrative absolutely is that there are concentration camps for Muslims in China.
Right.
And so this starts, so we start with, there is a reality on the ground of people in places that are not their homes for some purpose.
Yes.
So then what's the next step?
Well, okay. So then it's basically racism, Orientalism, that is the next step. There's nothing in between. There's no it's Radio Free Asia, doing what Radio Free Asia does, which is creating anti-communist propaganda in favor of Western imperialism, as it has done for its entire existence. Like Radio Free Europe, which for some reason still exists. But yeah, I mean, it is in service of imperialism that these narratives begin, and then it's very easy for people who have been inundated their entire lives with stories. So Orientalism is a complicated thing.
We could do a whole episode on that.
We could do a whole episode on, but it essentially comes down to this. There's a lot of different ideas that are encompassed in it. God, I don't even know what to say or where to begin. But ideas of Asian people being sneaky, of being conniving, right? Of being both weak and effeminate, but also manipulative and greedy. I mean, this goes back to all the way back to I forget what they called people, but they had subgroups. They had
with the Mongoloid,
Asian,
Mongoloid,
Well, no, it wasn't. It was Americanus, which is Native Americans.
Asiatica
or something. Asiaticus. And the person who wrote this down had never been outside of Europe, I think, or some nonsense like that. But had all these preconceived notions because of stories that he had heard.
Right.
And so he writes down that Asians are sly, conniving, but hardworking, things like that. It was like there's things like he called people from Africa lazy, mentally deficient. I think he said the same about Asians. I wish I could remember his name.
Everybody except the Europeans,
right?
probably.
Yeah, Europeans were, of course,
the peak,
the standard.
of course,
the pinnacle, because the belief was that Europeans were the next evolution. They were the highest evolution, right?
They're the Goldilocks, right?
Right, just right. But that's where this comes from, and it never went away.
Well,
and people continue to believe this to this day.
Well, and that's the thing with ideology, is that it is so ideology like this, it is contradictory. Like in the United States, you see with people with Latinx people, you've got they're simultaneously they're lazy and they're just coming to leech off welfare. Mm-hmm. But then you also have at the same time the narrative they're going to steal all of our jobs.
Yes.
And because they're willing to work for less.
Right.
And then I mean you back hundreds of years ago and forever, with Jewish people, they're simultaneously communist, Bolshevik subversives and also arch capitalists.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's just this contradictory thing.
This comes to the point that I make a couple of times in the paper, but it's the fact that two ideas which seem to contradict each other can work together to the same goal. And so, for instance, a very easy to explain iteration of this is the idea that immigrants from Mexico are both lazy and trying to steal our jobs,
right? Because
those two things work together to have this weird legal gray area for immigration where it's very difficult to get into the United States, but it's not impossible. And they don't want it to be impossible. They want it to be very difficult,
right?
Because they don't want people to go home. They do not want immigrants to go back to Mexico. They don't want them to freely cross the border. They want them to stay here and work, but be in a very precarious situation. And the reason for that is that it keeps them scared to report things.
Right.
They won't report their employees for wage theft or for poor working conditions or for underpayment. I mean, any number of things. They won't call the National Labor Relations Board,
NLRB.
Yeah, they won't call that, even though they are entitled to the same protections under the law as U.S. citizens, because they're afraid that if they do that, then they'll get INS called on them.
Right.
They'll get ICE called on them. So they keep them in this precarious state by having these two narratives that are opposite from each other. You have these people who are here stealing our jobs and people who are hardworking. They are both lazy and they are these incredible people who help to build this country, right? This liberal fucking what is it? They do the jobs that Americans don't want to do, right?
You see, like liberal darlings saying this exact thing. We have to.
We want them here because they do the jobs we don't want
to do. Exactly.
Right, and they're like, that's
we
great.
Like fucking white.
Those two ideas together are what keep people in the situation they're in.
Right, and it keeps them this precarious underclass that we need.
Exactly. If we were to say, nope, no immigration whatsoever, fuck them, they can stay out, they'd be gone. If they said they're allowed to be here, we welcome them with open arms, then they would be here and safe.
Right.
But then wages would go up.
Right.
In both cases, wages would go up. So they need both of those things, which are contradictory to each other, but they need them both, which is why the Republicans are constantly harping on about stopping immigration, and the Democrats are constantly harping on about we need them here because they do the jobs that we don't want to do.
Yep.
They keep prices down. They keep prices down on berries, right? Which is, obviously the issue is global capitalism, and there's a whole lot going on there that we could get back into, like the Bracero program and how all that shit went down.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna do at some point. I want us to do a globalization episode. Yeah. We absolutely need to.
So basically, as getting all the way back to this point, Schmidt and Patterson are basically saying that like local histories get erased by international capitalism. It's a thing that happens. They call it one of the most cancerous products of international capitalism. But intra-nationally, they say the state exercises power over the production of local histories in various ways: censorship, the appointment of official state historians, the allocation of resources for research and training that serve to amplify knowledge only about the period with which the state is identified, the sponsorship of archaeological methods that ensure the erasure of local histories from the landscape, and sanctions against and outright suppression of those who attempt to challenge official histories. So what they're basically saying is there are a lot of different ways that the state, and obviously in this case they're referring to the bourgeois state, but that they erase particular aspects of history that don't fit in with the period in which the state existed. So, or with which the state identifies. So if the United States really wants to focus on indigenous history, they really want to talk about Thanksgiving, right? But they don't want to talk about the Iroquois League of Peace and Power. If they want to talk about how multicultural the United States is, they want to talk about Ellis Island. They don't want to talk about how the U.S. annexed a massive section of Mexico, and basically said Mexicans get out, right? There are certain aspects of history that they want to talk about, and so they will erase or downplay anything that doesn't agree with or doesn't line up with those values. Part of that is, again, that general idea of these are the values we hold dear. And part of it is capitalism, and really, I don't want to get too far into the idea of scientism. But as the belief that there was a natural order to things became dominant, and that natural order was an evolutionary process, people misinterpreted the work of Darwin to mean we are going from shit to incredible, right? We're it's that social Darwinism idea of we're going from hunter-gatherer to civilization, right? We're going from savagery to civilization.
Well, it's the idea that there's a target. It's
right.
It's targeted. It's going from worse to better.
Right. And that's not the way that is not what happens in evolution. And evolution does not apply to social, social issues, social concerns, societies and whatnot.
Well, and the thing
evolution is a matter of life adapting to its conditions.
Well, yeah. And they say survival of the fittest, but that's not a more accurate description would be survival of the adequate.
Right.
Yeah. There are, if it works, if it allows you to survive that, those genes will continue.
Crocodiles and sharks have been the same forever.
Yeah. They're fine. They don't need to change.
Yeah. Because it works.
Think it's self-contained within a few. It's it's over generations.
Yeah.
It's a long process.
Yeah. Right. But capitalism is an ideology that likes numbers. It's an ideology that enjoys linear and sterile explanations of here is the beginning, here is the middle, here is the end. That's why we think of things like the Industrial Revolution or the Bronze Age or whatever, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. We want to see things as having a clear beginning and a middle and an end, and a height and a decline and things like that.
And Marx and Engels are sort of guilty of this, of talking about, the advancement of society, quote unquote,
Sure.
because they're writing in that time period where that's everyone's, evolution is this brand new idea, and all of the scientists and theorists we're trying to apply this to everything. Yeah, and that's not to say that Marx was wrong.
Sure.
But I think it's easy to fall into, and probably Marx did, an idea of worse to better, moving on from.
I think though in Marx's writings, he's not really making an evaluation of this is an improvement over another thing.
Well,
I think with the
sure.
exception of, when you get to socialism or communism, I think because he was there living in the shit
Right.
of
Literally.
and he's not saying it is a linear progression from one to the other.
Right.
I think he's saying there is a conflict among classes, and basically whoever does it better wins, right? And that's why Lenin is rad.
Well, yeah, and I guess I didn't articulate that very well. I what I just meant was I know, yeah. I mean, I guess you could just say that it was more of an observation of hitherto the history of all existing society.
That's basically it. Yeah. It's class struggle. Yeah. But anyway, sort of another key point, I suppose, is that written history tends to be viewed as a record of the past, when it is in fact a reflection of the present. And I think the best example is we should go back to that episode, The End of History, where Hyder's talking about that documentary series about the Vikings. It's a documentary about documentaries about Vikings, and how in every decade the Vikings have changed who they were and what they were about to reflect whatever was
the values
going on.
of the society.
Yeah. So in the 50s they were like whatever violent imperialists, and then in the 60s they were
free love.
They were free love, like flower children. And then in the 70s they went back to a little more like edgy.
This was like the globalization sort of spreading out.
Yeah.
And then the 80s they were
greedy. They were there about the money.
Yep.
Yeah. So, but that's the best example, I think.
Well, and I remember I was going to say, based on what you said a few minutes ago, that's sort of where this whole idea that I cannot believe we're still seeing this, of evolutionary psychology comes in, where it's like the way things are now, we have evolved to be this way. They have to be this way through all of these biological forces. The way things are, that's just the way it is. I mean, I have seen some ridiculous evolution evo psych takes. Like I think one of my favorites was that women like pink because it was the color of the berries that they would harvest.
That's incredible.
Like,
especially since in the 19th century, pink was a boy's color.
Right.
Exactly. It's completely ahistorical. It doesn't take anything into account. It's looking at like, all right, what's going on right now? Oh, pink seems to be a girl's color.
No, I wonder why.
It always was. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. But anytime like you see evolutionary psychology, or like, the idea that like, oh, women like shopping because they were the ones who were mostly doing the gathering back in these Paleolithic societies, and it's like, it's a field entirely devoted to justifying and normalizing the status quo.
And it's not just at evolutionary psychology. It's economics. I think we mentioned once the archaeology of like finding quote unquote mass graves.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Like this in the 20th century, they would find piles and piles and piles of bones. And so they assumed, oh my God, it's a mass grave. It was warfare. It was genocide. Right. But in fact, they found that the people died over the course of hundreds of years, that they were all different ages, mostly elderly and children, because that's who dies the most.
And there was a ritual significance to burying people in the same place. It's not they didn't all die at the same time.
Right. They would all get buried in a single location, because whatever, there was some sort of ceremonial religious ritual.
You mean like a graveyard?
Like that. Yes.
But it's like I mean, imagine people like 10,000 years in the future coming here and looking like there's all these stones here, like all these people died, like there was a mass, like 10,000 people died in the span of like a week. Well, no, most graveyards it was hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Like that's just exactly. It's completely ahistorical. But it's the 20th century.
The
20th century, we're seeing so many like genocides and like and we're seeing warfare and death on an industrialized scale. And we're trying to why is this happening?
Doing this? Yeah.
And it's we've always done this.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so it's okay.
It's a just so sort of like argument.
Well, I mean, this is sorry if you heard this on the bonus episode, but it's the same thing. No, it's what was it? The post hoc fallacy.
Yeah,
it's like
Right.
this
After the
happened,
fact.
so therefore it had to happen that way, right?
Yep. So, and this is again a thing we talked about on the End of History episode, but it's this concept of
This is a clip.
just a
This could be
repeat.
just a
Just
clip
cut
episode,
clip
like
show.
greatest hits, a clip show. Yeah.
you take clips from
Integrate
all
it.
our best episodes.
Can we take clips from the End of History episode and make it sound like Hyder was here?
Yes, I can probably do that.
There's this documentary series about the Vikings. No.
Just have it like fade in, have some like dramatic music in the background, and have like a music bed that sits under it as Hyder talks. Yeah. Yeah, it has kind of like spacey, echoey sounds
there we
in the
go,
background. Yeah.
Not like in memoriam
Oh, jeez.
Oh my God.
piano music.
Press F to pay respects. Okay. So this is about the creation of silences. So within history,
Just Pierre Trio.
not Pierre though.
Oh fuck no,
Michel
Rolfe.
Yeah.
God damn it.
Michel Rolfe trio. So he says that they occur at the moment of fact creation, which is the making of sources. So this would be like, whatever. I'm on the battlefield at Antietam, and right before the battle begins, I'm writing down like how many soldiers we have and how many soldiers the enemy has and their cavalry.
My dearest Clara.
Yeah, my dearest Clara.
450. Yeah.
And I write down how many cannons we've got and how many I don't even know if there were cannons at the Battle of Antietam. Probably.
They had cannons at that time period.
Sure, but whatever. Anyway, so they're writing down this information, but I don't write down what was the weather like, how cold was it outside, where were the washerwomen? Were they inside the camp? Had they left the camp? How many people were writing letters? Were there people observing the battlefield from the side? Civilians who had nothing to do with the fighting? I mean, any of this information I didn't write down. That is a silence, right? That does not ever enter the record. And so we are not aware of it. And if you have a particular dominant ideology that, again, has seeped into people's brains, the things that matter to them that they're going to write down, or the things that they think are going to matter to other people are going to be the same things over and over and over, which is why we don't get these other stories. Reason number one, that silence in the sources. So then there's the moment of fact assembly, which is the making of archives. So if somebody wrote down, the washerwomen were here and they washed 4,000 pants, sheets, and then they left at 8 a.m. That one of them got struck by a bullet. Like if somebody who is like getting together all these things and they're like, well, that's not important, and they throw it out. Again, there's another point at which we don't get to see that thing. So maybe somebody did think it was important, but somebody else who was creating the archives, who was putting it together, decided, well, this thing over here is important and that thing over here is not important. I'm going to toss this. And then you get to the moment of fact retrieval, the making of narratives. So when people write histories later on based on those archives, based on those sources, they decide which they're going to pull back out again. So again, maybe somebody at the beginning thought this fact was important, and then somebody who was creating the archives was like, well, this is also important. I think this is good. But then the person who comes along and actually writes the history, they decide, no, I don't think so. This is not important. I'm not going to include this. Then it gets, that is another form of silence. And then there's the moment of retrospective significance, the making of history in the final instance. So if there's 50 history books written around the same time period, but one of them is deemed to be the most important history, that's the one that's going to get read the most. That's the one that's going to be most important. And all of these other histories that have been written down also don't get read, don't get like taught in school. But I think there's another point where this happens, and that is among individuals who are looking for a history to read or a documentary to watch. They are choosing which ones to watch. They are choosing which ones to read. And to some degree, that's going to be based on these things that I already mentioned.
Right.
Like, which ones is Amazon saying is the best seller? Which one
what's
is
trending on Netflix?
Which one is PBS playing today? Which one is Netflix saying is most popular, or whatever. But like, even if those things were not in place, you're still going to have a set of ideological like parameters that have sort of been dropped on you from a child, like growing up in this society, there's going to be a certain set of ideas about how the world is that are going to shape your decision-making process. And if I am looking at 5 different books and one of them, I look at the back cover and it says Stalin was bad, actually. And then I look at the back of another one and it says Stalin was good, actually. I'm going to be like,
what
whoa,
bookstore are you at where
the
you're
fuck
finding
is this?
that?
Yeah, no, but I'm saying, like, if all things were equal,
right.
all books, if Grover Fur was next to Anne Applebaum, I still think Anne Applebaum would be read more than Grover Fur because it's in your head already when you go to the bookstore that Stalin is bad. And if you pick up a book that says Stalin was good, the only reason you'd read that under normal circumstances is, wow, that's edgy. You know what I mean?
Well, and that's why you get I mean, talking about Grover Fur specifically, that's why you get all these people being like people who have not read a single word of him, like who only have read other comments on this. It's this reaffirming cycle, like, oh, he's terrible history, like he's a Stalin apologist, blah, blah, blah. When the idea is it's a counter narrative. And so people are assuming like, oh, well, it's just trying to be edgy. Like it's inherently bad history, because if it was good history, it would be saying what we already know.
Right. Exactly. And the best example of this, like from my own experience, is when I was in 4th grade. We lived in Texas, and 4th grade is when in the United States, you take your state's history. And so I took Texas state history in 4th grade. Oh, and I learned about the Battle of the Alamo, right? And it was this story about how Santa Anna descended upon the Alamo with an overwhelming force, and he just he destroyed these.
Who's Santa Anna for those that
don't
know U.S. history?
Yeah, no worries. He was a Mexican general, and
Santa Anna did nothing wrong.
Santa Anna did nothing wrong.
He probably did. With indigenous folks. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fair. But anyway, he was a Mexican general.
We support critical support for Santa Anna.
Yeah. So. He was a Mexican general who was in Mexico, by the way. Texas was in Mexico. And he was attempting to get rid of these white people who were in the Alamo, which was a Spanish mission and then converted into a fort. Anyway, it's whatever. And
fuck the Alamo.
But the story is that this tiny number of men held out for, however long, I forget now because it's been forever, but held out for X amount of time. Everybody was slaughtered except for one person conveniently got away to tell the story.
Yeah. Funny.
But it was about Texas fighting for its independence from Mexico, and how brave was that?
Remember the Alamo.
Remember the Alamo was the battle cry. And the reality is those are all facts. Santa Anna was a Mexican general. He came in with an overwhelming force. There were a handful of men who were in the Alamo who defended it for X number of amount of time. They all got killed eventually, but they fought very bravely. And the battle cry for the independence movement in Texas was "Remember the Alamo." Those are all facts. But what nobody thinks to question when they learn these things is why these facts, why these stories, like why not these other stories, why not these other facts?
Right.
But the reality is that these freedom fighters in Texas were not from Texas. They had come from Kansas. They were slave owners who were trying to keep their slaves, and Mexico had at that point not outlawed slavery. And in Kansas, which was this weird,
it was up in the air for a while.
It was up.
John Brown
did his thing.
His thing.
The what are they called? The Blue Jays, the Jayhawks. The fuck was it? The
Kansas.
Probably the Jayhawks. That's the name of one of their college football teams.
Their major sports team or whatever,
right,
is named after these people who not them.
It's the Jayhawks.
It's the Jayhawks.
The other sports team.
That was the nickname that was basically for the people who were fucking with slave owners. They would come in and liberate slaves or kill slave owners or whatever.
Much better than Kansas's other shitty.
Yeah, I mean, and it's wild because none of that has been
No, of course not.
Right.
Yeah, it's a bird.
All been removed. It's a bird. Yeah. But anyway, so these slave owners were I'm gonna fuck off to Mexico, and it was Mexico. So I can keep my slaves. And then Mexico outlawed slavery.
God damn it.
And
said the Texas people.
Yeah. I mean, they were like, I'm going to do a revolution now.
Well, right. 'Cause, yeah, they outlawed slavery, which is a problem when you have white people in your area.
Right. And the Mexicans were like super happy to have these white people here because they were worried that the U.S. was going to invade them anyway. And they were like, hey, if I put some white people on my border, it'll be cool. They won't invade us anymore.
Doesn't help.
Guess what?
No.
It's not cool.
Yeah. So the entire Texas Revolution was fought for the sake of slavery. And remember, the Alamo is basically a white supremacist chant, if we're honest. So, I mean, basically the point of that entire 30-minute diversion was that there is the story which I learned, and then there is the broader context around it, which all got ignored and gets pared down to these very, very simple, very basic facts, which again are facts, but they support a particular narrative about the identity of Texas and about the United States in general. That it's about freedom and about independence and about fighting for what you believe in. They just don't tell you that what they believe in is fucking slavery. And that's what it comes down to. I mean, in fact, the only reason that Texas remained independent, that it declared itself as an independent nation, as a republic, was not because they wanted independence. They definitely wanted to join the United States. It's because at the time, the policy was slave state, free state, slave state, free state. If you were joining the Union as a state, it alternated back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And at that time, the next state to enter the Union had to be a free state. And so they needed to wait until another state joined the Union before they joined the Union so they could keep their slaves.
Thanks, Washington.
Yes,
right?
I think it was Oregon.
Or was it Oregon? Okay.
Even though Oregon was founded as a white supremacist state, no shit. That's in the founding charter of Portland. I think was that they were like, we are going to create a city for white people, and only white people are going to be welcome here.
That's basically every city in the U.S. at that time.
Yeah, but I mean that was.
I was going to say Portland is like that.
Yeah, but I think actually they didn't want slaves because they didn't want black people to be there, is what was going on.
Wow.
So so they were super excited about founding their white supremacist free state. But once they did, then Texas could join as a slave state, which is the point at which they stopped being a republic. It was never about independence. It was never about freedom. It was about slavery. Because that's what matters in the end to capitalists, is how can I make the most amount of money with the least amount of effort. So getting back to the subject of that imperialism, that power dynamic issue. So we have to think about, what is the function of history? What purpose does it serve? Why do we study history? Why do we record history? What is it? What is history? And so again, I'm going to go back to Trio on this one. He says that history is to a collectivity as remembrance is to an individual, the more or less conscious retrieval of past experiences stored in memory. So if as an individual, I'm thinking back to my past, history is that to a group. So a group, whether that's a nation or a people or my family, even, that's a history, right? It's no longer my memory. It's a family history. And that is extremely sad when you think about the things that we mentioned already, the past, which gets erased for particularly indigenous groups. Your history either didn't exist, it doesn't matter, or it matters significantly less than this other story that we're trying to tell. It's basically you're ripping their memories out. Right. You are taking the memory of their people and removing it from them, which leaves people adrift, and it messes with people, I think, on a fundamental level. Which again, going back to the end of history episode, when the reality that you see around you doesn't match the stories you're being told, that fucks with you, and you start looking for Like Hyder says, people turn to conspiracy theories because that's it's a common sort of response to things don't make sense to me. There must be some grand like group in control that's hiding things. It's aliens, it's lizard people, it's whatever.
The Illuminati.
But yeah, that's kind of where that comes from. I think.
Well, and those incongruencies can also make people internalize a lot of the hegemonic narratives that are given to them.
Yeah.
Like, even if my family tells me this history, I don't see it within the collective history. So that must mean that they're wrong,
Yeah.
Which is really sad.
And I think that is sometimes a like survival tool. Like,
right. 100%.
I'm here living in this society and everyone keeps repeating the story over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, so I have a coworker and his parents emigrated from Vietnam in the 70s or the 80s, maybe. And he wrote this like story out about his mother and how she misses home and how much she wants to go home, and all the violence that was experienced in Vietnam that she had to live through. But she blames Ho Chi Minh for that.
Right.
And you can't go to someone who's experienced that and be like, you're wrong. It wasn't Ho Chi Minh, it was US imperialism.
Right.
But that is, and she's also not stupid.
Right.
But she is now living in the United States. She has to survive here. She is being told all the time that the United States is good and that the United States was in Vietnam for good reasons and their cause was just and all this stuff. And so perhaps she's just internalized that idea that
100%.
it was not the United States that was to blame. It was Ho Chi Minh. Right. And that happens, unfortunately.
Right. And it's coming from a voice of authority too.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's easier to, if you're already a marginalized person, to go with the collective history because it puts you at less of a risk to be a target.
Right. Yeah. But essentially, so I think the academy likes to look at itself, the university system likes to look at itself as being sort of above the bullshit, right? Like they're not subject to the same like economic pressures as news media or movies or television. So the stories that they're telling are far closer to the truth than these other like narratives, these other ideas. And so and to some degree I think that's true because there's not always I was going to say there's not, but there's not always a profit motive in what happens in the academy. You get grants and then you do research, and then your research you publish in a journal, and whatever. Like that's the process within the academy. Versus if I'm writing a history book for a general audience, I have to get a publisher who is like, okay, well, how many units can I move of this history, right? And so there's always got to be some kind of, first of all, it's going to have to, almost certainly going to have to reinforce the dominant ideology, but it's also going to have to make money, and so it's going to have to be salacious enough that the public is going to care about it. But the academy likes to think of itself as being above that. But so there's this guy DeSerto, and he says, but this community is also a factory. Its members distributed along assembly lines, subject to budgetary pressures, hence dependent on political decisions. So, when I said, okay, well, they get these grants and they do this research and they write these papers that then get published in journals. Yeah, it's not motivated by profit in the same way that a person writing for the general public is, but those grants are coming from largely private and NGO organizations. They're not coming from like they're not just handing out money to anyone. You have to write a grant proposal beforehand that says, here's the research I'm going to be doing, here's what I'm trying to argue, here's what I'm hoping the end results will be, and here are the parameters and blah blah blah, whatever. But it's going to need to line up with the values of that institution that already exist. And as state funding has been cut from universities over the last 50 years, people are more and more dependent on private institutions and NGOs who are highly ideological,
Right.
who have a very specific bent that they are looking for particular results in a particular direction. Like if I was like, hey, I want to prove that Stalin did nothing wrong, nobody's going to give me a fucking grant for that, right? Like nobody's going to give me a grant for that. But if I wanted to say, I found out that there is this mistress that has never been written about that Stalin had, and I want to dig into that and find her family, they'd be like, yeah, that sounds salacious.
Right.
And, I'm sure some history, probably the NED would give me some money for that. But like, it, even though it is not subject to the same pressures as the market, it is subject to political pressures and economic pressures. And again, as state funding has been cut, as federal funding has been cut to universities, this becomes a worse and worse problem. De Certeau was writing this in 1986, and the problems were not nearly as bad as they are now.
Right. Yeah, it's much worse now.
Yeah. So like there are various aspects to like the socio-political and socioeconomic like paradigm that we live under that all contribute to the way in which history happens, and also is like remembered, like the way we remember history. But then history tends to reinforce itself that way. Like once it becomes that dominant narrative, once it becomes that dominant discourse, then it's a feedback loop. It just feeds back into itself over and over and over. It's not, which is not to say it's a closed system. Like new ideas can be brought in, but almost always those new ideas are similar to or related to the ideas that are already there. Like liberals love success stories about marginalized people who became millionaires, right? Because it's a rags to riches story. It is I faced insurmountable odds, I overcame them, and I got rich, right? Like which is basically proof, quote unquote, proof that capitalism works, right? When a poor person gets wealthy, it's proof that capitalism works as a system. When a black person or a gay person or a trans person makes it big, that is also that same story, just shifted slightly. And none of it's true, obviously, because for the vast majority of poor people, you're never going to be rich. And for the vast majority of black people and gay people and trans people, you're never going to be rich because you are an outgroup. Poor people are an outgroup. Black people are an outgroup. Gay people are an outgroup. Trans people are an outgroup. They are not part of the elite. They are not part of the central core identity, which is, white, largely male, straight, cis, right? Like those are normal in the eyes of the United States particularly, but Western capitalism in general, and I think globally largely. And so if you are outside of those things and you make it big, that's a story that liberals love to tell, because again, it reinforces the idea that capitalism works in spite of the fact that systemically it does not. Systemically, you aren't going to make it big if you are one of these things, because you have everything against you, or you have most things against you. So here's another quote. Berlin of 1884 was affected through the sword and the bullet, but the night of the sword and the bullet was followed by the morning of the chalk and the blackboard. And this is by a historian, and I'm gonna fuck this name up, and I'm sorry, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He's an African historian, but he's talking about basically the shape of Germany as a nation, which then because that was the point at which the idea of a nation state of Germany was sort of being born in the late 19th century. It was a bunch of principalities before and kingdoms and whatnot. But anyway, yeah. So I'm going to move on to sort of the actual like events of history here. And I'm going to begin with looking at the background of imperialism and colonialism, because one of my main arguments is that U.S. national identity is inextricably linked to imperialism and colonialism. Like imperialism and colonialism are a foundational piece of U.S. identity. And I guess I'll get to that later on, but that's kind of why I'm setting this up, because you have to understand both of those things, imperialism and colonialism. So India is sort of the foundational example I used for imperialism, and then Southern Africa for colonialism. Both of them were British colonies, and I chose them because Britain was sort of the main influencer of what American politics looked like. Mm-hmm. So for all the libertarians out there who don't listen to us, the beginning of imperialism in India was not the British state coming in and taking over. It was the East India Company, who had their own navy and had their own army, and they began sort of, in quotes, innocently, as just trying to trade. They were there to trade with on the Indian subcontinent, but as is always the case with imperialism or colonialism, there's never enough. You have to keep building, and you have to keep adding on, and you have to expand and make your system more efficient, and so as they met resistance, as they found that not everyone on the Indian subcontinent was interested in doing business the way they wanted to, they started to use more violence. And so they, as a company, not as the British government, but as a company, moved in and began taking over principality after principality after principality. Now, there was a major uprising in the north of India, which the EIC, the East India Company, couldn't deal with. And so they were like, please, Mother Britain, help us. And so the British military moved in, at which point it did become sort of a state operation. But, again, for the libertarians out there,
it was started by a private company.
It began as a private company who had its own military and navy, and shockingly, they still did shitty things because capitalism. It's not the state, it's capitalism, homie. But part of the ideology that Britain took on when it moved in as a governmental institution was that they felt like they had to guide the development of India, that it was that they didn't know what was best for themselves. And so the British government acted as sort of a parent to India to improve its condition. And Queen Victoria was, in 1877, she was declared Empress of India, which was a mimicry of the title of the Mughal emperors, who had been the rulers of India at large prior to the invasion. So here's a quote. So there's this guy Lytton, who he was a policy expert. So he felt that the Indian chiefs and princes were not like they weren't just nobility, but they were and I quote, powerful aristocracy whose complicity could be secured and efficiently utilized by the British in India. In addition to their power over the masses, the Indian aristocracy could be easily directed if appealed to properly as, and here, this is a quote by Lytton, they are easily affected by sentiment and susceptible to influence of symbols to which facts inadequately correspond. The British, Lytton continued, could gain their allegiance without giving up any of our power. To buttress his argument, Lytton referred to the British position in Ireland, and especially the recent experience with Ionian Greeks, who, notwithstanding the good government which British rule gave them, enthusiastically surrendered all these advantages for what he termed a bit of bunting with the Greek colors on it. He added, to underline his argument about the Indian aristocracy, the further east you go, the greater becomes the importance of a bit of bunting.
Big yikes.
Yeah, big yikes. I mean, you want to, these are the roots of Orientalism, right? And which is goofy, because one of the things that the British did in India was impose heraldry upon the Indians. The feudalism did not exist in India the way it existed in Europe. And we're talking about the 19th century here, so feudalism was dying anyway. or it was probably dead, but the like trappings of feudalism were still there. The like coat of arms, the like family crest, like these were not concepts which existed in India. The idea of knights, which again, knights didn't really do anything in England anymore, but the ceremony of knights still exists today, right?
Elton John's a knight.
Elton John is a knight, right? So the idea that a bit of bunting matters the further east you go is goofy if you consider the fact that these things were imposed upon India. The idea of knighthood, the idea of hereditary nobility, like these things were brought to India from Britain, and yet this dude is like, you know, a bit of bunting matters the further east you go, right? But that's his perspective. And then, and again, if you think about some of the more like ceremony laden iterations of Christianity, like that is a very Western sort of, well, I mean, I suppose not necessarily. The Eastern Orthodox Church is pretty ceremony laden, but it exists in the West to a huge degree. But again, you can forget these. If you're a racist or an Orientalist or whatever, you can impose these ideas of like, they believe in symbols, they believe in ceremony, and we don't. We're scientific, you know. We have minds that extend beyond this. Even
we have
though
purity balls.
We have purity balls, you know. Yeah. So, kind of getting back to that, like two ideas that may like seem at odds, but actually are working to the same goals. There were two different schools of thought within Britain on how to govern India. One favored this sort of feudalistic setup of like, you know, we'll have a governor, and then we'll have you know, people who are more regionally connected, and then we'll have people who are lower than that, and it'll just kind of spread out in like this triangular fashion, but among the Indian people, right? Like not British rulers kind of going down, but like we'll set up an Indian aristocracy, and then we'll have Indian knights and so on and so forth. And then others were like, no, that's not very logical. We need to break it up by, you know, who are the most important people to different communities. So like the Sikh people, we need to find out who their leaders are, and we'll put them in charge. And the Muslim people will put their leaders in charge, and the Hindu people, you know, break it up in a like ethnic or religious way. You know, how can we figure out how to break that up, and we'll do it that way. But neither of them were arguing that we need to stop doing imperialism. They were like, what's the most efficient way to do imperialism? Like, how can we get the most out of these people by legitimizing particular people among them? Should we do it regionally, or should we do it ethnically? You know, but they were both working toward the same goal. So when the assemblage of 1877, when Queen Victoria is declared Empress of India, there were protests against it from English people who were in India. Some of them were like, hey, there's a famine in Bombay going on right now. It seems like it might be bad optics if we hold a major celebration right now while people are dying, spending all of this money when people are starving to death. Yet other people complained that they were allowing black people a seat at the table with the queen, figuratively speaking. You know, but it didn't stop it from happening. It happened anyway. One of the things that happened at the assemblage, though, is that a bunch of Indian nationalists met for the first time from all over the country, and that they basically say this was sort of the birthplace of Indian nationalism, in addition to being the like celebration of imperialism. But so the person who wrote this section of this text that I'm quoting argues that, and here's the quote: "The British idiom did not die easily or quickly, and it may still be alive in various forms." He's saying that these Indian nationalists had learned from the British how to organize a society, and that even after the British moved on, the nationalists in India continued to construct their government, their organizations after the British did, in the same sort of pattern. which reminds me a lot of when I was doing research for the paper that I wrote on Germany that ended up being the first episode. I found this book that was written by this dude who, it was in the lead up to the fascist takeover of Germany, and he was frustrated, so he wrote this story. It was about the German Revolution, and how Ebert and the Social Democratic Party did not do enough to get rid of the previous order, that they maintained a lot of the same structures of the German Imperial High Command and the military. And the name of the book was "The Kaiser Goes, the Generals Remain," which, is basically what happened. And, there was the rising tide of nationalism that he was responding to essentially at that point.
Right.
So colonialism, the challenges are different from imperialism. In imperialism, the point is, let's extract the most amount of resources with the least amount of output, right? Like, you want to keep the minimum number of people there from your own country. You want to attempt to find individuals within that country who will serve your interests, so that, again, you can put forth the minimum amount of effort and draw out the most amount of resources. In colonialism, in settler colonialism, the point is, we're going to move in. This is now ours. We're going to take it over. And so you typically, in imperialism, it's mostly a matter of like upper class, petty bouge, like administrator class people. That's it. Those are the a military class will also show up to complete your ends. But in settler colonialism, you're going to have everybody across the spectrum. You're going to have those high class individuals, the military, the administrators, but you're also going to have working class people who get imported to do labor. Mm-hmm. And in Southern Africa, the Prime Minister of Cape Colony in 1908, his name was John X. Merriman, and he said that the white workmen who had previously been regarded as lower class in Europe, they were, and I quote, "delighted on arrival here to find themselves in a position of an aristocracy of color." Although they were, poor, working class, shit on, spit upon in Europe, they arrived in South Africa and they were like, shit, I'm better than the black people here, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's what happened to white people in North America as well after, the quote unquote invention of racism. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff that went on like this. There was an elevation of all positions when it was in service of colonialism. So there's this dude, this guy, Lord Bryce, who he wrote about sport fanaticism in England and how it was a vulgar display, which was counter to the core principles of gentlemanliness. But he said in Africa, it was elevated to a virtuous outward expression of internalized patriotism. Maybe the air was just different. But yeah, again, things which were vulgar in Europe were elevated in Africa because it was in the service of colonialism. It was in the service of settler colonialism. One of the problems that was happening in Europe at the time was there was an educated middle class that was emerging. Because prior to this, only the wealthy really got educated to any significant degree in the 18th century. But by the 19th century, that had been extended down to the middle classes. And so you had all of these people who received an education, but there were no positions in Europe for them to fill. And so they were being exported to Africa, again, as an administrator class, or to other colonies. Yeah. So the headmaster of Harrow, which is a school in England, he declared that an English headmaster, as he looks to the future of his pupils, will not forget that they are destined to be the citizens of the greatest empire under heaven. He will teach them patriotism. He will inspire them with faith in the divinely ordained mission of their country and their race.
So getting back to that like idea of like what these narratives do, not just to the people who are being oppressed, but to the oppressors. Like imagine if you're this like, middle class, like random dude who, you just got a college education. You're the first generation in your family to do so. And now you've got no money, but you get done with school and somebody's like, you are doing God's work in this other country. Like, what does that do? Like anything is justifiable at that point. My country supports me. I'm getting paid to be here. God supports me. Like what else can I, what could I possibly do that's going to be wrong in this situation? Nothing, I think, is the answer, which is why you had so much violence and racism and like, I mean, this is eventually the apartheid state of South Africa, right? Like all of this is justified in the name of God and country and empire. It all builds one on the other. So moving on to, I guess, how to construct a national identity. I think one of the best examples it's what's known as the Roman salute, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. It was, it's when people say Heil Hitler and they put their hand out, it's like a 45-degree angle out. Your hand is pointed upward. And it didn't originate in Germany. It began in Italy as like a signal of respect to one another. They were looking for an alternative to what they refer to as the bourgeois handshake, the germ-ridden bourgeois handshake. They try to find some kind of an alternative way of greeting each other that was powerful, that didn't require human contact, and that wouldn't spread germs, right? So this is what they decided upon, because they were like, well, this calls back to the Roman Empire, right? But it doesn't. Like, there is very little evidence that this was a broadly used way of greeting one another in Rome at any point in its history. So they called it the degenerate, effeminate, and germ-ridden bourgeois handshake. Yeah. And so, like, again, I'm going to keep harping on Trio, but he says that from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s, Americans learned more about the history of colonial America and the American West from movies and television than from scholarly books, which I think is definitely still true. From the 1950s to now, probably before the 1950s, people learn more from television, radio, fictional books than they did from television. But so this dude Winkler is the guy who writes about the Roman salute. He says, all manner of spectacle, not the least the historical epics on our screen, were and are politically important, nowhere more so than the systems of totalitarian power in the 20th century, which I'm sure he means Soviet Russia as well. But in this case, he's writing about the fascists. There were lots of different ways that Romans greeted each other. They would stretch their arm out directly to each other, so kind of like the fascist salute, but straight out instead of up, right?
High five.
There was the hand raised to shoulder height with the elbow bent. So a lot of like pictures of popes, they have this, but with their like finger down. But there's a weird story. Somebody thinks that it might have been a nerve, that there might have been nerve damage that one of the popes had, and he kept his fingers down like this, and that everybody just copied him because they thought that's what it was. But there are Roman like frescoes, statues and whatnot, where people are greeting each other with their hand basically at shoulder height, faced out. There is also the gesture that's similar to the current military salute, like hand to the forehead. And then basically shaking hands was a way that Romans greeted each other. There's some evidence that something like the fascist salute was used by the Emperor Domitian, but circumstantially. And it was the carvings that we have of him, the like stone carvings that we have of him when he's doing this. It's when he has
taken over a city. Like they have conquered it, and it's like I have subjugated you. And so he does the quote unquote Roman salute, but his elbow is bent slightly. So it's not like straight arm, hand up. He's like this, right? I'm going to argue that all of the examples that do exist of this happening, it's a static recreation of a living moment, which is to say he might have just been waving, right? Right. Anybody, if you're like this and you freeze it, now they're in Rome or like in Roman societies, they would use what is the fascist salute, hand outstretched, palm out, right? When they were making a promise, the symbology was before heaven, which is why your hand is up instead of straight out. I declare that I will do X. And, it's basically like, I swear to God, right? Like that's where that's coming from. And you could argue that that's what the fascists were doing, was like, whatever. That's not what they were doing. It was a matter of greeting. It was a like salute to one another. But here's where it gets weird, right? Like there was a film. So largely films were considered to be like for poor people, right? Like you went to the opera if you were a rich person, or you went to see a play if you were a rich person. Poor people went to the movies. But yeah, so the Roman salute starts showing up in plays in the United States, actually around the same time it starts showing up in Europe. And again, there's not really a clear understanding of why it started to be used in this way, but it just like seeped into the collective consciousness in some way, and began to show up in like P.T. Barnum took this play on the road, which was essentially Roman events, but set in modern America. And they used the Roman salute. In the 1892 World's Fair, the Pledge of Allegiance was accompanied with the Roman salute when it was debuted. And in fact, you can find pictures from the early 20th century of American school kids doing the salute to the flag as they say the Pledge of Allegiance. But anyway, so in 1914, there was a historical epic called Cabiria, which it depicts the defeat of Hannibal and the implementation of imperial Roman control over North Africa. And so the Italian national poet, Gabriele D'Annunzio, was involved in the production as like a consultant, basically. And because of his involvement, a bunch of wealthy and elite Italians went to see the film, which again was not typical because it was seen as like fair for like poor people, for the underclasses, for degenerates, basically. Here and again, this is how it transitioned from being like a thing that happened in fiction to a thing which happened in reality, which is D'Annunzio in World War I became a military commander. And he like often used this sort of like flamboyant style of presentation when he addressed his troops or people he captured in battle. He'd go on a balcony and give these like arm waving speeches and like just sort of like out of control, using acting techniques to influence people. And he started to use the salute. He started to use the Roman salute in those speeches to like fire people up, like to get people to respond, because again, they had seen these things in movies and he was repeating the things that they had seen in movies or in plays or whatever. And it's probably unsurprising at this point that in 1919, Benito Mussolini was mentored by D'Annunzio, which at this point, I think Mussolini was still referring to himself as a anarcho-syndicalist. But even the other syndicalists that knew Mussolini were like, this dude was in it for the like fame of it, not for principles, which, obviously he became a fascist. So, yeah, like I don't know. I mean, there's a lot here, which I'm going to skip. But there's a lot about, fascism and its involvement in archaeology and how they influenced what was and was not studied. The Nazis were super interested in, they took a different direction than the Roman, than the fascists in Italy did, in that they were way more interested in indigenous, quote unquote, German archaeology, whereas the fascists in Italy were very interested in Roman archaeology. The Germans thought that because they were descended from Aryans, that Germanic people were the only ones that mattered, and people who were from Greece and Italy were too close to Africa and therefore too open to the influence of whatever degenerate races. And so again, they focus much more on Germanic peoples, and when they found widespread archaeology of Germanic origin, that was proof that actually all of this land belongs to us, right? Like we're allowed to expand in here because historically this was ours, even though obviously Germanic speaking peoples from whatever 1500 BC did not identify as German, right? Or Aryan or anything like that. So getting to U.S. history, here's a quote by Teddy Roosevelt. Every immigrant who comes here should be required within 5 years to learn English or leave the country.
Sounds familiar.
Progressive Teddy Roosevelt.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Something that I have memed a couple of times is Frederick Jackson Turner's The Significance of the Frontier in American History, which is also known as the Frontier Thesis, or the Turnerian Myth, so he basically was writing, he also presented at the World's Fair. I think it was the year after the Pledge of Allegiance with its Nazi salute was was released. But he was trying to figure out what made America exceptional. It's where the idea of American exceptionalism comes from. Is he was trying to figure out what made the US different from Europe, which was its progenitor, right? And his argument was that in Europe, if you wanted to expand, you were bumping up against your neighbor, right? Like this other nation, this other kingdom was there. And so you had to fight a war in order to take it over. But in the US, the frontier was there. And you could just move through.
Nobody lives there.
You could just move the frontier to the west. And he does briefly mention Native people as helping Europeans to move through the area, or he says that Europeans would use old Indian trails to move through territory. But anyway, it was empty is basically his argument. And that strong men, and he really almost exclusively, in fact, I think exclusively he mentions men, would move into an area and they'd set up homesteads, and then people would come behind them and set up towns to sell to the homesteaders, and cities would be built up, so on and so forth. But that's his argument, is that it was empty land. It was open land. And he was writing this as what he called the close of the frontier in 1893, I believe it was. My argument is not that this reality is what makes America exceptional. It is the belief in this reality that makes America exceptional. It's the belief that the land was empty, that the Spanish had not already colonized major sections of the West, that the Russians were not already in the Pacific Northwest doing some colonialism of their own, that these foundational things had not been set up, that Mexico had not to some degree colonized the West, that you could forget all those people, that you could forget all of the native people, that you could forget the women and the children who came with, that you can forget all of those things, and that it only comes down to strong men exerting their will. It's the belief in those things that makes America exceptional. None of it is true. It's all fucking false. But that is what, and it, of course, as soon as the quote unquote frontier closed, that's the point at which the US began to do its imperialism, right? That's when we went to the Philippines. That's when we went to Cuba. That's when we went to Hawaii. Like the close of the frontier only meant, well, we've reached the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
Let's keep on going.
Let's keep going. Yeah.
Right. Let's keep expanding. Because what made America wealthy was the ability to move into these areas unimpeded, quote unquote. The ability to take them over, to do imperialism, to do colonialism is what made America rich in these early days. And so it had to keep doing that thing or it would not be rich anymore.
Right.
So as far as the US building its own identity, there were a couple of things that were at its foundation. There were 2 questions being asked, according to this author, Thomas. What does it mean to be not British? And what does it mean to be an American? So the Boston Tea Party, which, is one of those big mythological, magical events in US history that gets called back to of like, wow, look how badass and cool the Sons of Liberty were or whatever. I think it was the Sons of Liberty who did that. Don't quote
Sounds
me on that.
right.
Yeah, it was the right period.
Sure.
So it was a bunch of drunken assholes. But the Boston Tea Party was an attack on private property, a subversion of law and order, and a break with civility, which, not really things that the US wants to see itself as. Like they imagine that it was attacking against the British Crown, but it wasn't. This was not the Crown's tea. This was a private corporation's tea that was thrown into Boston Harbor. And it was symbolically an attack on King George and Parliament, but it was not literally an attack on King George and Parliament. But they dressed as quote unquote Indians when they did it because they were taking on this other identity in order to do this thing, because it was outside the realm of what would have been accepted for Europeans to do. And even though obviously they were European and they were not really native, it was like a dress up thing of like, we're going to do this. And that frees us from the bonds of like psychologically. I mean, who knows what they were thinking, but that's what happened.
Wow.
But that's not really who native people were, right? They weren't going into Boston Harbor to throw tea in the harbor. That's what the colonists imagined native people to be like. It was an image of not the reality, not a recreation of the reality of native people. It was an image. It was mythologization of native people, and that is as close as native people came to being accepted in the United States, was this point. Like it only gets worse from here. Like there were 2 different approaches through basically the end of the 18th century and all of the 19th century. 2 major approaches was either kill them or have them assimilate into white culture, basically. And assimilation was the more, liberal, I suppose, approach to that. The problem is that there was never a point at which native people could be assimilated enough, right? Like there were attempts by native people to become like the white settlers who were moving in, most notably amongst what they called the civilized tribes, so here's a kind of breakdown. The southeastern tribes were agriculturalists. For 2 or 3 generations prior to 1830, farmers among them fenced their plantations and, quote unquote, mixed their labor with the soil, which is it's a quote from Jefferson, who, he was like, he really valued Jefferson, like it was Jeffersonian agriculturalism is what they call it, where he was like, the way we're going to enfranchise poor white people mostly is getting them to own their own land and mix their labor with it, their own sweat. They're going to toil. That'll civilize them, which will then allow them to vote, basically. But anyway, mix their labor with the soil, making it their private property according to accepted definitions of natural law. White traders who settled among the Indians in the mid-18th century gave original impetus to this imitation of Anglo-American agricultural methods. And then following that, missionaries moved in who brought, literacy and Christianization to the Cherokee and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, who then built mills and trading posts. They passed tribal laws which declared that they wouldn't cede any more of their land, so that they could continue to develop in the way that they had already started to develop. They were, for all intents and purposes, assimilated. They were doing everything by the book that these white settlers had put out there, and yet it wasn't enough. I mean, they passed the Indian Removal Act, and the Choctaw and the Chickasaw and the Cherokee refused to leave. They were like, no, we're fine here. And so the federal government sent investigators down to figure out why they didn't leave. They were like,
this is weird.
They're like, hey, we're giving you some land over here in the West, which is nowhere near your current home, that you can go back to the practices that you were participating in before we got here. Don't you want that? Like, don't you want freedom? Right? Like, don't you want to go back to the way you used to be? And they were like, no, because this is our land and we want to stay on our land. And if we have to adopt your customs to do that, we'll do that. So these investigators were sent down there, and the investigators decided that the reason it was happening is that white people were intermarrying with and having children with the native people, and the children were acting as go-betweens between the white world and the Indian world, and that these greedy interlopers were the reason that these Indians didn't want to leave and go west, and that it was but basically it was race mixing, quote unquote, that was causing the problem. Now the idea of Indian removal goes back to Thomas Jefferson, but obviously it didn't get passed until Andrew Jackson. And Jefferson, Monroe, and Jackson all thought that this was going to be a peaceful process, that it was going to be peaceful ethnic cleansing, that they would be like, hey, we'll give you some land over here. You can go live the way you used to live. It's going to be cool. And they were shocked when it wasn't, which of course, then they had to be force marched,
of course,
Trail of Cheers, because so good times. Basically my point is you cannot assimilate enough to become white. And that's the problem. Like, it was never a matter of assimilation. It was a matter of whiteness. Yeah. And there's tons more examples here. Most notably, Chivington, and Black Kettle. Chivington was this extremely racist, U.S. Army, colonel in charge of the Colorado Volunteers, who massacred, Black Kettle's village in Sand Creek while he wasn't there, while no one, most of the warriors had left on a hunting party. So it was mostly women, children, old people. And the thing about Black Kettle is that he was constantly conceding. He was constantly doing whatever it was that was asked of him by the U.S. government. He said, if you fly the U.S. flag over your village, you won't be attacked. If you relocate to this place, you won't be attacked. And his village was slaughtered anyway. And then later on, he was killed by one of Custer's, Custer was in charge of the party, and one of Custer's men killed Black Kettle in a totally separate, unrelated incident. And both of these were as a result of escalating retaliations for completely unrelated events. In other words, all Indians are the same. They are all responsible for the actions of whatever a handful of them do, which is always the case in minorities and outgroups, is that, white people can stand individually on their own, stand for themselves, but anybody who is of a minority or a marginalized group, they represent their entire group. So when somebody does something terrible, it's all X group is bad. When we get into a lot of stuff about the fact that once the Indians were gone, once they were dead, or on reservations, then there was this like hand-wringing nostalgia for what was lost, like how sad it was that they were gone.
With everything,
right? Yeah. Once all of the Indians were dead or on reservations, out of sight, out of mind, again, or dead, then it was like how sad. And then we started putting them on coins and on stamps. Conversely, Black people not until way later. And in fact, the first time that a Black person appears on a coin, it's a slave on one of those state quarters from 2000.
Jesus.
Yeah. So, again, because Black people never went away.
Yeah, they never went away.
Yeah. So we're going to skip all the way ahead to modernity because otherwise we'll be here all night. But this is a quote by Ayn Rand.
Oh, fuck. What did I sign up for?
Slavery is something which only the United States of America abolished. But now, as to the Indians, I don't even care to discuss that kind of alleged complaints that they have against this country. I do believe, with serious scientific reason, the worst kind of movie that you have probably seen, worst from the Indian viewpoint, and to what they did to the white man. I do not think that they have any right to live in a country merely because they were born here and acted like and lived like savages. Americans didn't conquer. Americans did not conquer that country. Yeah. So what she's saying is slavery is only abolished by the United States, in spite of the fact that the United States was one of the last countries to abolish slavery.
Yep.
But also she believes basically what all of the movies say about Native people and how savage they were. And then that the United States didn't conquer this country. I don't know what she thinks happened. They just moved in.
They civilized it.
They civilized it. Yeah. And like, it's deeply troubling. It's a deeply troubling perspective, but it also makes sense if you're Ayn Rand, because she sees the United States as the exemplar of capitalism. And she believes deeply in the moral good of capitalism, the virtue of selfishness, right? And so the United States could not be bad because it is the best example of capitalism. Now, whether she really believes that, whether she has internalized that, whether she is lying, it doesn't really matter to me at this point. That's not the point of why I bring this quote up. The point is that this is something which people do believe. This is a thing which people are capable of believing based on the information they have received about the United States. People will say similar things about the United States today. And again, it doesn't matter whether they're lying. It doesn't matter whether they are telling the truth, whether they believe it deep in their heart, or it's some sort of like surface level analysis. It is something which somebody could arrive as a conclusion based on the information which most people are given about the United States. They can disbelieve negative aspects. They can believe only the positive aspects about the United States. That is a potential response to learning US history. So I guess getting all the way back to the beginning when I was talking about like the genealogy research, there's stuff that I did not choose to focus on when I was doing that research. One thing that I found out was that one of our like great grandfathers fought for the Savannah River Regiment of the Confederate Army. I found a will from another family member which left 3 slaves to his eldest son. One thing that we learned when we were kids was that one of our ancestors left land to the University of North Carolina, basically, to the state of North Carolina to found the University of North Carolina. And one of the things that, like, I went to archaeological field school. One of the things that it's kind of a mixed blessing, like, I don't know, bittersweet sort of thing, is everywhere I go now, I can look at the ground and find like flakes that when somebody was making tools at some point in the past, left behind. I can find scrapers that were used to scrape meat and gristle off of animal skins. Like, these things are everywhere, which is neat, but it's also depressing because it's also unequivocally evidence that all of this land was occupied by somebody else a long time before we got here, that all of this developed land was occupied before it was developed by Europeans, you know? And I guess the point of all that is that, like, I can point out direct examples of slavery in our past, right? Like an ancestor who owned slaves, not like plantation size ownership, but 3 human beings were owned by one of our ancestors. That the only reason that our ancestor could give land to the state of North Carolina is that it had been taken from Native people before that. But even if that wasn't the case, you get benefits from the things that happened in the past. You are directly the recipient of the, like, you could not be here. You could not live in this house if the land had not been taken from the native people who lived here before. Whether it was, I think in this area it was the Ute, but also I think the Cheyenne came down from the north for religious and ceremonial purposes at Garden of the Gods. I mean, it's an area that has been used for thousands of years. There's evidence of settlement from like 9,000 BC on the west slope of Pikes Peak. And so the only reason the United States exists is because of this settler colonialist process. But people don't like to think about that, which is, why I think there's so much resistance to decolonization as a concept, is that people don't like to think about the fact that their entire existence is predicated on genocide and theft. And if you admit that, where do you go? What is the response? What morally can you do? And certainly conservatives are never going to cede this point, but even liberals are reticent to respond to this. But it's all, again, tied to that social reproduction of history, that idea of, this is the story we're going to tell ourselves because this is the story we have to tell ourselves to perpetuate the society we currently live in. And again, the longer it goes on and the more deeply entrenched it gets, the less you think about it. And the easier it is to just accept that this is the way things are.
Damn.
All right. Thanks so much to Jeremy for coming on tonight. He may have been here anyway, but who knows? Thanks so much to everyone listening. There will be some suggested reading in the show notes. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting things to read about this.
I have like 40 sources in here.
Big Share them all. Share them all. Because the more sources we have, the fewer people can yell at us.
Big notes.
All right. So our sponsors are all of our excellent fans on Patreon. As always, we have way too many record each time now, but since the last time we recorded, which was a while ago, these are the new ones. So there's a lot of them. We've got Adamaru X, Ara, Ashley, Austin, AW, Ben, Bingus O'Dingus, Calvin, Carly, Chris, Connor, Corey, Corwin, Critical Support for Blizzard. See, you can see how long this has been. Blizzard's walked their pro PRC stance back. So
yeah, I know, fuckers.
They apologized.
Duncan, Edward, Eric, Garrett, Gary, Gay Guevara.
Nice.
Well done. Grant, Grayson, hello, Jacob, Jacob, Joseph, Josh, J.S. Aurelius, J.W., Kevin, Lee, Louis, Manuel, Matthew, Max, Maxim, Maximilian, Meme Manifest, Meredith, Mike, Mitch, Peter, Rube, Ryan, Saya, Soy Cheese Degenerate Tank Scum, Simon, Siren Z, Talking Socks. Again, do you remember Talking Socks?
I do remember Talking Socks.
They're back.
Yay.
Violet,
Maybe
Vice.
we can mail them their button.
Man. All right. And Zach. All these people are inspiring and revolutionary and make it easier for us to make this podcast for you and have it sound good. We've established what we're calling the USSP with several child podcasts, and we started centralizing links to the various feeds on our website. You should check that out. Also, we want to thank Ransom Notes for our intro music. You can check him out on SoundCloud. And please don't forget to rate and review. Visit prolespod.com. Like us on facebook.com/prolespod. And follow us on Twitter @prolespod. If you have any feedback, topic ideas, or suggestions, you can feel free to send those to us at an email, at prolespod@gmail.com. Or use the comment box on our website. But if you do that and you want a response, please put a fucking email in there. Because
oh god, yeah, somebody sent like a really long, like serious thing, and Ethan was like, "Can you please respond to this? Because I'm dealing with some other stuff." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I got on there and I was like, "Damn, that's serious." They didn't leave any contact info, so I have no way to respond to their serious and sincere criticisms. And I was like, "Shit."
Damn. So anyway, yeah. So please,
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
person.
You probably know who you are.
Yeah.
You're probably not listening to this.
Yeah, no, definitely not.
So anyway, thanks for tuning in, and solidarity forever.
Bye.
Bye. Okay.
Bye.
It's morning in America, and you can be your best. If you have a valid credit card and can pass a urine test. It's midnight in El Salvador. They're spending dollars in your name. It's no bloody consolation that Reagan cannot run again. They'll trade with the Ayatollah if they can't convince Congress. The only type of patriot is an anti-communist. And I shake my head and wonder, what would Joe McCarthy say if he could walk through downtown Washington DC today? The CIA on campus are taking down some names, inviting folks to join them in their coke and dagger games. And does it ever prick your conscience, as we are the world you've seen, when you know today we're so far away from the dreams of Martin Luther King, the brotherhood of the elephant and the party of the ass, are desperate for contestants to take part in the farce of selling democracy down the tubes with the ad man's expertise. The majority by their silence paid for days like these. Best we can achieve, and wearing badges is not enough. Days